Hey nerds, we are going to be talking about a project which kind of focuses on both pattern and emphasis, okay, and how we can create that using just a couple things. So I just got some watercolors here. I have some Sharpies, and then I have my pencil with some watercolor paper. So basically the first thing we need to do is figure out what are we going to draw, okay? So you could draw almost anything, like you could do some like nuts and bolts, or you could do maybe some cactus, maybe some cool gems, that could be cool, or some flowers. Flowers could work. Or we could do, ooh, I know this one, light bulbs, beautiful. Or if you feel a little hungry, you could do things like cupcakes or cookies or pie. Things are in nature, so like leaves or something. We could do some buttons. I got a lot of those lying around, okay? Or we could do something like mushrooms. I actually like mushrooms. It's the one that I'm going to be using for today because mushrooms are kind of, you know, disgusting yet cool at the same time. So let's do it. So what you need to do is you are just going to be drawing several of that same object. And it can be different types. So like I can have these different types of mushrooms. I could do all the same ones. I can make up my own with these as inspiration, whatever I feel like. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be drawing several of them, but of different sizes. So I'm going to be filling up my page with a bunch of different ones. So maybe some of them are kind of lumpy, okay? Maybe some of them are a little bit taller, okay? All of mine, you know, are going to have those spots because I think that's going to be fun, okay? Now, after you kind of sketch this out, remember, this doesn't have to be a perfect sketch, okay? And it doesn't need to be dark either because we're going to be erasing a lot of these lines, okay? These are basically placeholders before we actually go over top of these with some Sharpie marker, okay? So if it's not perfect, that's fine. We want to have our Sharpie part being much better. Okay, the part that I really want to show with you guys is that we're going to be dividing our background into chunks, okay? So our background's where our pattern's going to be, our objects are going to be where the emphasis is, okay? So what we're going to do is we are going to be creating some like bubbles in the background, kind of big blobs, and we're going to use these blobs to separate the background. And what I want you to see is that I'm leaving a gap, a space in between my object and the blob, and then also the outside of my paper and the blob itself, okay? It doesn't have to be perfect either. They're not going to be normal shapes because your objects aren't normal shapes, okay? If you accidentally get a little bit close to your object in one spot, it's not the end of the world. Just go with it, okay? Just go with it. And then do it all the way around. And you can just start and stop these whenever you feel like it. Notice how like sometimes it's, you know, right at the beginning or end of a mushroom, sometimes just wherever I feel like stopping it, okay? So you just want to have some, you know, decent sized chunks here and there, okay? And that's why I did not have some of my mushrooms super, super close to the edge, because I want to be able to have this sort of bubble gap in between my object and the edge of that page, okay? So you're going to be first sketching it with the pencil like I have here, but then you're going to go back and you're going to go over these lines with some Sharpie marker. And I use skinny Sharpie marker for mine, okay? So going over the edge with the Sharpie marker, notice how there's a gap in between the edge of my paper and all of my objects, as well as around each of my objects. I made sure they weren't so scribbly anymore. I made my mind where I wanted the lines and stuff, okay? And the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to be filling up each of these bubbles with pattern, okay? And so, you know, there's a lot of different options for patterns, okay? There's, you know, polka dots, stripes, everywhere in between, okay? You're just repeating lines and shapes, okay? Because we're not going to be repeating colors because we're just using a Sharpie marker. And I guess you can kind of repeat values, I guess. You know, I have sort of like a medium and dark, but still with the Sharpie, okay? So I'm going to be filling up this whole back thing, and you can do a different pattern for every single one of these blobs, or you can do the same pattern for each one. The key is to make sure that you have repetition that is predictable, okay? Because remember, pattern is the repetition of art elements in a predictable way, okay? So I'm drawing a swirl. What do you think I'm drawing next? A swirl. Then what's next? A swirl, okay? So I'm pretty predictable here with the specific line, okay, because I'm doing like a spiral line, okay, over and over again, super predictable. So I'm making sure I fill up that space, okay, and I'll be doing this over and over again until I no longer have any empty blobs, okay. So after I get to that point with my empty blobs, I'm going to be starting to add some watercolor, okay? So remember, the watercolor is not for the space in between. It's not for these blobs. It is only for your objects that you drew, whether it's a mushroom or a hat or whatever it may be, okay? So this is what it's kind of look like towards the end, okay? Notice how I filled in all of my blobs with a pattern. I could have just did different ones, but I did the same one for the whole thing. That's totally fine, okay? And then I used color for every one of my objects, okay? Using it with my watercolors, okay? Now, a couple of things that I want you to know. Number one, okay, is to take your time on the watercolor part, because if we go super, super fast, we might end up bleeding all over this place, okay, which would really stink, okay. And number two, notice how, like, I have my red dot here, and that is filled up in the circle, okay, but see how these ones kind of bled, okay. The difference between them is one of them was made when the other color underneath was wet, and the other one when it was dry, okay? Because something to know about watercolors is they travel where the water goes. That's where the color ends up. So what I did on this one is I painted the yellow, I waited it for it to dry, and then I painted the red. So that is a little fancy tip if you ever want to take a painting class. It's one of the first things you learn about when you work with watercolors. Super cool. So the other thing I want you guys to know is if for some reason you hardcore mess up, okay, even if it's on the watercolor part, you know what you can do? When it's dry, flip open over your paper. Notice how I can't see the watercolor or the Sharpie through on this back side, okay? So you always have a second chance. So even if you mess up, you can try one more time. So that's all I got for this specific project. If you have any questions, be sure to let me know and check out my other videos.